I'm Steve Seibold. Good evening. I'm here representing the Western Forest Insect Founders Award Committee, one of the members on the committee. Barbara Bentz is our chair. Ken Raffa was in the back somewhere. He's also on the committee. Joel McMillan, who's not here, and Bill Rial is another member. So tonight it's a great honor and a privilege for me to be able to introduce Richard Skeeter Werner and Edward Holsten as the 2010 recipients of the Western Forest Insect Work Conference Founders Award. Speaking on behalf of my co-nominator, Andy Graves, we're pleased to have both Skeeter and Ed here tonight and welcome them and their spouses, Pat and Sandra as well. The Founders Award has been presented 17 times before, and Barbara and I were arguing over whether we have an 18th and 19th or we're just going to call them an 18th. But they are jointly the 18th recipient of this award since 1991 was the first one. Now, in a twist on the nominating process, we nominated them together. And the reason we did that, this dynamic duel, is because of their combined record of exemplary service in forest entomology in Alaska, primarily in the areas of research, pest management, and outreach. Together, this team of Werner and Holsten, or Holsten and Werner, has published 31 non-technical papers, 181 technical papers, and 5 book chapters on a range of topics centered on entomology and ecology of forest insects in Alaska. As an illustration of that synergy, let me see if I can advance things here. As an illustration of that synergy, they co-wrote this fantastic little guidebook called Insects and Diseases of Alaskan Forests. And they did that in 1980, and it's been reworked and re-released 3 subsequent occasions. The major career contributions were in the area of biology and management of Alaskan bark beetles, though, and in particular, the spruce beetle, which is probably the key pest, as many of you know, of boreal forest. However, they also carried out a significant amount of research on lepidopterans and defoliators of aspen and birch throughout their careers. These are just some samples of the articles that they published over the years in biology of the spruce beetle. Skeeter was born on February 20th, 1936 in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he's going to take you way back with some baby photos and things like that. I'm just going to give you the broad outlines of his life. He took his first job in forestry in 1957, 2 years before I was born, and he was a forester on the Alcoa National Forest in Oregon, and he earned a master's degree in entomology in 1966 from the University of Maryland, and then in 1971 he earned his PhD in entomology from North Carolina State University. Before and after his academic training, he was bit by the bug of Alaskan forest entomology, having begun his research career in Juneau, Alaska in 1960, working on the black-headed budworm and the hemlock sawfly. And although he spent parts of the next decade working as a research entomologist for the old Southeastern Forest Experiment Station at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, Skeeter moved back to Alaska for good in 1974 to the Pacific Northwest Research Station, where he worked out of the Institute of Northern Forestry in Fairbanks, Alaska. So, on to Ed. A comparative whippersnapper, Ed was born in 1944 in San Francisco, California. He graduated in 1968 with a BS in Forest Management from UC Berkeley. Berkeley in the 60s. I'm thinking Ed's going to elaborate a little bit on that when he gets up there. He worked from 1968 to 1971 as a forest entomologist for the Peace Corps in Santiago, Chile, and completed his master's degree in 1972 and his PhD in 1977, both in forest entomology and both at the University of Washington under Bob Garrett. After a brief postdoctoral project on the Cygnus spruce weevil at the University of Washington, Ed moved in 1977 to Anchorage to start his hybrid position, where he was an entomologist with the old Forest Pest Management Unit, or Forest Health Protection now. And he was also simultaneously a research entomologist with the PNW station. And so he worked in Anchorage his entire career. With his robust physique and manly good looks, Ed has been the quintessential outdoorsman of the Alaskan woods. Deep down at some level, Sandra has to have realized that this guy was quite a catch. Ed's specialty was organizing and inspiring people and communicating his science through outreach. He He produced many technical bulletins, fiddles, and things like that nature. And his excellent research activity was generally quite targeted and led towards pest management guidelines. Then there was Skeeter. Skeeter was no doubt the brains of the operation. As you can see here, he's resting his brain. He really led the way by fitting the Alaskan experience to big picture issues like disturbance ecology, climate change, and the like. He published his work on taiga or boreal forest ecology in really high quality outlets such as the journals of Ecology, Oikos, Ecologia, and the Annual Review of Entomology. He's also published several really good synthesis chapters in monographic books from Springer Verlag and the Oxford University Press. But tonight, I think what we're celebrating here is the importance of friendship, cooperation, and the synergy that two scientific careers can generate to move a scientific field forward. And to understand what makes a good scientific partnership tick, I thought we might consider some very famous and successful partnerships of the past in other areas, perhaps. Having problems here with my mouse. So, here's a successful partnership. Our Skeeter and Ed, the Rogers and Hammerstein, Forrest and Amalfi. Another successful pair. Super Bowl fame in American football. And in deference to our Canadian hosts in the land of the Crown, where many of their ancestors hailed from, how about Sherlock Holmes and John Watson? And finally, we have Werner and Holsten, Holsten and Werner. So what are the qualities in these partnerships that make them special, make them unique, make them highly successful? I think there's at least 4 things, and you can probably think of more. And these are the types of things that the American Council, I'm sure, will tell you about too. One of the things, you have to respect one another. You have to have confidence in the other person's ability and respect. Secondly, you have to communicate. Just imagine publishing 31 papers together, all the communication that went on during that process of organizing the work, writing it up, and publishing it. The third thing is a shared curiosity, enthusiasm, and work ethic for the activity at hand. And obviously, as you'll hear soon, Ed and Skeeter certainly have had that. And then lastly, patience and trust, which I think goes along with respect. So, for those of you that are embarking on careers and you've got a great research partner out there, think of these qualities as models for you in the future. So that's my brief introduction. With that, I'm going to call Ed and Skeeter up here, and Andy Graves is going to come up as well. We're going to award them the plaques, and we'll just read briefly what's on here. I know many of you have seen these on display, but we'll just read for each of them, and I guess we're going to take some photos too at the same time. So Ed, Skeeter, and Andy, would you please come up? How about a round of applause? Okay, congratulations first to Skeeter. And I'm just going to read what we have on the board up there. Skeeter Werner formed a synergistic team with Ed Holsten that had a profound effect on all of entomology, let alone forest entomology in the state of Alaska. He led a major research effort to define the biology, the ecology, and the management of the spruce beetle in Alaska. And he raised international pioneering awareness of the effects of climate change and disturbance ecology on boreal insects and forest ecosystems. And lastly, he shaped the history of western forest entomology in the latter part of the 20th century. Congratulations, Skeeter.
Thank you. Now for Ed. Ed formed a synergistic team with Richard Skeeter Werner that led a profound effect on all of entomology, let alone forest entomology in the state of Alaska. Ed led an exceptional science-based technical assistance effort on spruce beetle in North America and worked tirelessly throughout the Americas with forest professionals to deliver his unique knowledge of forest pest management. Ed facilitated opportunities for international and national cooperators to conduct research in Alaska's great outdoor laboratory, And he also maintained an unparalleled and personal style of collaboration which fostered many long-term professional relationships and contributed to the development of Western forest entomology in the latter part of the 20th century. Congratulations, Ed.
All right, so we're going to hand the floor over to Skeeter. You're going to learn all about his life.
Congratulations.
My first question is, would you rather hear me talk or see me dance? I can do a quick I want to thank the Word Conference for giving us and I this prestigious award. I retired 15 years ago, and I've been looking forward to this day for a long time. I also want to thank Steve and Andy for all the effort they put into nominating us. I know it's a lot of work to nominate one person, but when two people are there, it takes a lot of effort.
You're welcome.
This is Mount McKinley in Denali National Park in Alaska, and I get over the slides as quick as I can. I have quite a few. Going back 76 years ago from the beginning. This was when I was 6 months old. And the reason I put this picture up here is because of my nickname. A nurse in the delivery room thought I looked like a comic strip character called Little Skeeter. So this was Little Skeeter. I know you're all thinking, how could such a cute baby turn into such a decrepit old man? I had 4 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. This was my senior year in high school. Before I went to school, I was off to, I was in the Boy Scouts. I was off to Fillmore Scout Ranch in New Mexico. But I went to Penn State and got a BS in forestry. And then I came out to Oregon. I got a job as a GS5 forester working in the Oakland National Forest, primarily doing timber inventory and also timber sale layout. I worked there only for a few years because I hurt my knee, and they told me I was a high-risk employee, so I left. Then I went back to school and got a second BS degree, one in entomology. That took me a year, and that was also at Penn State. Then I got a job in Juneau as a research entomologist, and I worked with Doug Schmiede there, and studied the black-headed bollworm and hemlock sulfide. And we did our research in the summertime off a houseboat, lived on a houseboat, which was like a paid vacation because we could fish anytime, went hunting, I had a crab trap, and even made homebrew. I left there in '64 and I went back to the University of Maryland and got a master's degree in insect physiology. Then I went down from there, I went down to North Carolina. I worked for the Forest Service at the Southeast Forest Experiment Station, worked at the Forestry Sciences Laboratory in Research Triangle Park, which is located between Chapel Hill, Raleigh, and Durham, North Carolina. I did research on systemic insecticide, and I worked with Chevron Chemical Company to help develop orthene, which is a prominent insecticide used nowadays in seed orchards, in gardens, and so forth. And then I also went to NC State, worked on my PhD, and which I did my research on Ips granicolis and the chemical chemicals involved in its behavior. While there, I researched Triangle Park. I met this hot woman who was a biological technician here studying the mites and columella in leaf litter on southern pines. We were married in '73 and left there in '74 and headed for Alaska. This was on the Alaska Highway. on our way to Fairbanks. This is one of the pleasantries of living in Fairbanks in the wintertime. This was taken out of our bedroom window one January evening. I worked at the Institute of Northern Forestry located on the campus of the University of Alaska, and this is the campus there. It has a student body, probably 10,000 students. These were our children, Luke and Sarah, born and raised there, and then when we moved to Oregon, after I retired, they went to Oregon State. This wasn't in our freezer, but we thought about putting it there. This shows where the boreal forest system is in North America. In Alaska, it's north of latitude 60, and as you move into Canada, it's north of south of latitude 60. And it's composed primarily of black and white spruce, birch, aspen, balsam, poplar. Oops. I'm going to talk about my position in Fairbanks before I go into spruce beetle research. When I first got there, I worked on a various number of defoliating insects. I want to show you the white spruce ecosystem in interior Alaska. That is the Alaska Range in the background, and the ecosystem there is made up of white spruce, primarily birch and aspen. Then the river bottoms are made up of tamarack and black spruce and underlaid with permafrost. This is just a picture of the Alaska oil pipeline that runs from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, Alaska. When I first got there, I set up a monitoring system in an experimental forest about 25 miles west of Fairbanks. It was a branch sampling monitoring system that sampled 8 different species of trees, and it went from a river bottom of elevation of 500 feet up to a ridge top of about 2,000 feet. I did this for 35 years, every summer, twice a summer. And last summer, Jim Cruz, who is a forest health protection entomologist in Fairbanks, took over the job. But you can see from this that we had several high populations of spearmore blackmoth, large aspen tortrix, large sawfly, spruce bloodworm, and aspen leaf miner. And the large sawflies, spruce bloodworm, aspen leaf miner populations became high in the late or early 1990s when temperatures started to increase in Alaska. Some of the other insects I worked on up there are listed here. It kept me busy. I had at least 7 studies going on at one time. When I first got there, there was an outbreak of a spearmark black moth, a geometric defoliator of primarily birch. It had never been studied before, so I had the opportunity to learn everything about it I could. I studied its biology, its behavior, its host preferences, its oviposition behavior. I discovered a new type of sex pheromone-producing cells in the abdomen of the adults, and I guess I became a world expert on that insect. This is the adult black-headed budworm on fireweed. Before the adults can mate, they have to ingest moisture in order to lay viable eggs. So this is in early May when they emerge from the pupal stage. I ran several weather data collecting systems. Of course, this was back in the series, they're still using hydrothermographs. And when I first got there the first winter, I had a weather station set up about a mile off the road, and I snowshoed there in the wintertime. So I got there one January morning, and I looked at the maximum thermometer, and it said minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I said, what in the hell am I doing here? My icicle was coming out my nose and off my beard, but it was an exciting time. And I was only about 30 years old. I was young. Another thing I looked at was the effect of wildfires on insects in Alaska. Lightning is the major cause of fires in interior Alaska. And most of them occur in white and black spruce, primarily in black spruce, which is a non-commercial species. This is the fringe area of fire where most of the bark beetle and wood borer activity take place. And it was a great place to do surveys of trees that were damaged by the beetle and by the fire, and the incidence of wood borers and bark beetles. In many cases, the wildfires completely destroyed the bark and the inner bark of the spruce trees. I know this came up somehow. Sorry about that. One of the things we looked at was the incidence of white-spotted sawyers, a longhorn cerambycid beetle. This was after a wildfire in our experimental forest, and on 1 square meter of bark surface, we got 500 attacks or egg deposits of the longhorn beetle. Of course, only about 10% of those survived. This was the white-spotted sawyer, which is very common in interior Alaska. Some people think it bites, but it just comes up with its mandibles and sort of samples your skin. They call it the pincer beetle. Oh, this is a willow ptarmigan in the spring of the year when it's turning from its white winter phase into the brown summer phase. And they're a staple food product for a lot of native Alaskans. Another stable food product is the caribou. Okay, then we got into spruce beetle research. Ed, I think, started working in Alaska in '75, and the spruce beetle was just starting to build up after a windstorm down on the Kenai Peninsula. So he and I at first put some plots on the Kenai at latitude 60 in Fairbanks at latitude 64 and up in the Brooks Range at latitude 68. And we sampled bark beetles. At that time there weren't any funnel traps, so we used the sticky coated cylindrical wire mesh traps. When we got there, we had to take a Coleman stove and melt a stick them and put it on with a brush. And but we got some real interesting data. We recorded all the bark, and then we also used felled trap trees. Recorded all the bark beetles in the bole of the tree, in the branches, in the twigs, and then I published a paper on the salinity of spruce in Alaska. Most of the research was on spruce beetles on the Kenai Peninsula, south of Anchorage. This is our field camp located on Kenai Lake. Some of you have been there, and it's at one time was a fire camp, and it's called Broadview Field Station. This was Ed. He didn't like to walk much. He liked to give orders from his four-wheeler, and one of his yellow labs always was following through. Which one was that?
Looks like Medora.
Medora. This guy was always going in. If you look in the water, there's salmon there that are going to stream and spawn. So that's how Ed would find where to go fishing. This came to us, a biological technician for Ed for what, 30-something years, and we're still working. We couldn't have got along without him. John Hart, who was a retired research entomologist who would come back, who worked for me in Fairbanks for a number of years, and then moved to Anchorage and retired, and came back as a rehired in Newington. John now lives in Palmer, Alaska. And this was the critter which we spent a lot of time studying. It's primarily found on the Kenai Peninsula in a species of spruce called lute spruce, which is a hybrid between Sitka and white. And it attacks lute spruce very aggressive. It also attacks white spruce. It develops better in white spruce, but it's not attracted to it as much as lute spruce. And then there's Sitka spruce along the coast of the Gulf of Alaska, and it very seldom gets in Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce has some qualities which inhibit spruce beetle feeding. Interior Alaska has primarily white spruce, but the beetles do not get in white spruce in Alaska because We feel that the moisture content of the inner bark is too dry to support spruce beetling. The only spruce beetles I ever found there were at the baseline of a tree, usually on river bottom sites that usually got flooded periodically. Ips beetle are different species. They're very aggressive in inter-Alaska. This was the infestation on the Kenai Peninsula. At the peak of the infestation, about 96, when some 4 million acres of spruce were infested. Those spruce that at the time were suppressed or maybe intermediate in size escaped the beetle infestation, and many stands are now coming back. Of course, that was almost 20 years ago, and of course, other stands where there wasn't any young spruce converted to birch or aspen, which is good for moose populations. Here's some of the effect of May to September temperatures in spruce beetle. Spruce beetle populations always seem to have a lag time after the increase in temperatures. And in the 80s, when the spruce beetle population started to increase after a massive blowdown, they were high, and then they dropped off about the 90s, and then they built up again in the early 90s and to the late 90s, and dropped down, and they've been low ever since. Most places they actually ate themselves out of house and home. Some of the research we did was chemical, where we field tested alpha pinene from talon, alpha pinene and amycol. We did cooperative work with John Gordon, and he did similar studies in BC. I told somebody the other day, I don't ever want to see another funnel trap. We're carrying too many. We also did some insecticide studies, trying to get a pest insecticide registered for use against the spruce bollworm. This particular study, 1980, we did along with Felton Hastings and Fred Hay from NC State, and we tested permethrin, chlorpyrifos, and phenethyl, which they work, but they also have a lot of effects on parasites and predators. This was the sprayer we used. We drugged the hose, I think 300 feet into the woods, and sprayed the bulbs of individual trees up to a height of 30 feet. Then we went back later and inspected the trees for bark beetles. We also intentionally sprayed some streams, and we had fingerlings caging the streams, and we did pre and post studies of the aquatic invertebrates in the streams to determine what effect these pesticides had on them. Of course, permethrin we found out, as the Canadians did, is very toxic to aquatic organisms. We also, this is not a preventive study, this was a remedial study Ed and I did where we sprayed bulbs that were infested with beetle brood and then hung them in plastic mesh bags, determined what effect the diesel had, if the diesel penetrated the bark and killed the beetles. It was effective to a certain degree. We also tested pine oil. Pat Shea, from living in Berkeley at the time, helped us do a lot of studies with pine oil. It's very messy and stinky. It smells like a Lysol. We did some dispersal studies using fluorescent powder on trees, and we set up funnel traps at various distances up to 2,000 feet away from the source of the beetle emergence. We collect the beetles, and like many of you have done, is check them with a black light. We found that both the spruce beetle and ips beetle flew as far as up to 2,000 feet from the brood tree. We did a lot of studies with MCH. I think we did studies for 10 years, bubble caps and beads. We did some bead dispersal using a helicopter and a bucket, but most of the studies were using bubble caps. And our results were very erratic, and we never did come up with a real recommendation using bubble caps. Later on, Ed did some studies with John Hard using, what was that?
Medicine.
Metacell with NCH in it, which was successful. Many of our NCH sites were in isolated areas. We had to use a helicopter to get there, which was very expensive. We camped out, sat around the campfire, drinking a little scotch at night. It was Ken Zogas and summer help, Lon Salisbury. We did a trap out study where we used phonotrans baited with high concentrations of alpha-pinene and MCOL. And in the lower left stand is the treated stand. You can see there aren't any, maybe a few beetle-infested trees, whereas all the other stands were controlled. So the trap out using those semiochemicals worked very well. The only thing is in Alaska, it'd be very expensive to get into areas to use this method. We also did stand thinning. We went into a white spruce stand. We had 4 1-hectare acre plots. We treated 3 of those. We did our own felling, and we used a cable system which was attached to pulleys about 12 feet off the ground, and this cable was continuous. And you took the bolts, which were cut into 3-foot lengths, and used baler's twine to tie them up to this cable. And then the cable would follow out to a point where you wanted to drop them, and a cutter would cut them off. It was very intense. Matter of fact, I had a heart attack after that. This is a site after thinning. I think what we thinned to 80. What was it? Do you remember, Ed, what we thinned to 80?
Yeah, down to 80.
Yeah. Oh, this is one. This is one of the critters we have to put up with in Alaska. I thought it was rather funny. This is a famous bar in Anchorage called Darwin's Theory. And I worked in Fairbanks, but whenever I visited Anchorage, I always had to go in here to wet my whistle. It was a nice bar because you can meet lawyers in there, doctors, longshoremen, foresters. I retired in '95. I stayed a year in Fairbanks, and then I tied up with the Institute of Marine Biology at the university there. And I worked in the long-term ecological research program known as LTER. And I started to study the effects of climate change on bark beetles, wood borers, and ground beetles. In the early 1990s, I was on the first forestry committee of the United Nations International Program for Climate Change. And we met in Joensuu, Finland, and there were representatives there from 6 other countries which had boreal forests. Finland, Norway, Sweden, Canada, Russia, and the United States. And we developed guidelines and scenarios for managing spruce forest throughout the boreal region. We did win a Nobel Prize. Al Gore won it for talking, not doing anything. This shows how the climate in Alaska is getting warmer. Warm sea currents, especially going near to El Nino, move north up through the Bering Strait and then across northern Canada, and brings warm air up over to the Arctic Ocean. That's why the ice cap in the Arctic Ocean is receding very rapidly. And temperatures in Alaska, particularly interior Alaska, have increased quite a bit in the last since 1980. Glaciers are receding throughout Alaska and elsewhere in northern, throughout the world in northern latitudes. This is a fire line through permafrost. Permafrost occupies the lowlands, usually next to rivers. Normally it's 80 feet thick in depth. In the summertime it usually melted back 1 or 2 feet. But since 1980, it has melted back 30 feet. And a lot of the Alaska native villages that are built on permafrost have lost their homes or cabins just because they sank into the ground. This chart to show the effect of temperature increases on the Aspen leaf miner. There was a small outbreak in the late 70s. It really had no correlation with temperature. But in 2004 or 5, the temperature increased quite rapidly in Fairbanks, and the Aspen leaf miner increased likewise. And its population are still going on 10 years after they started. I also looked at ground beetles. I was using pitfall traps to collect ground beetles in Fairbanks. Ground beetles are good indicators of climate warming. And as time went on, and as I moved north in latitude, I collected more ground beetles and more species of ground beetles. And I collected these beetles in Fairbanks and all the way up to the Yukon River. So, I had a good career, had a lot of good people, worked with a lot of good people, worked with a lot of you, and it's time to get on. Thank you.
Okay, Ed, it's your turn.
Just a moment here. You don't need to put one on yet, Steve. Or are you going to do it on? Well, this is I'm kind of teared up right now. Anyway, it's a hard act to follow. Trying to prepare for this presentation was an interesting experience. You know, it's kind of like you can say anything you want. And that's kind of a blessing and a curse. You can talk about anything, but you got to talk about something. But first, I'm really honored to be a recipient of this award, especially with Skeeter. I have to give a lot of thanks to Steve and Andy for nominating me. The amount of work they went into it was incredible. Also to the Founders Group for nomination. And as long as I thought about this talk, in all the years I've been pumping around with Skeeter, instead of duplicating a lot of Skeeter's information in his studies, which we worked on, because I first met Skeeter, we'll get to that, in 1974. So we've been banging around together for a number of years. So instead of duplicating a lot of those studies, I think I've got a few slides, and a lot of you know who I am, a lot of you don't. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about myself and how I got into this this great run I've had for a long time. I was born and raised in, I was born in San Francisco. I grew up in the Bay Area. And my first experience in entomology, I was about 10 years old. And I decided to dig up a hornet's nest. So my neighbor and I smoked it out, I dug it up, I reconstructed it, put it in a cardboard box, put it in my bedroom. About 5 days later, to the dismay of my mother, as all the adults emerged. That was the end of my entomological career. And graduated from high school, and I went to a number of colleges. Back in the late 50s, I was into surfing, California. So my folks said, we got to straighten this kid out. We'll send him to Cal Lutheran College, which was 30 miles from Malibu. So that was fine by me. So I went down for 1 year and decided to go into forestry. And I didn't have all the quite courses to get into forestry school. So I went to UC Davis for a year. And after a year at Davis, I went into Berkeley in 65, around in 1965. At that time, I didn't have any forest entomology. So my first forest entomology course, now this is a trio to draw from. Professors at that time, there were three: Ron Stark, Dave Wood, Don Holsten. And let me tell you, these field trips in the 60s were legendary. And I was just telling Steve, the only big field trip we had was Dave and Don. We loaded up some vans, like Friday. It was our major collecting trip. Then we had to produce a collection. Took off Friday night, drove all night to South Shore of Tahoe. That's the last we saw of Dave Wood and Don Holsten. Till Monday morning. So, you know, we wandered around in South Shore of Tahoe in the casinos for a couple of days. They came out Monday morning, we hopped in the van, then we collected like hell all the way back to Berkeley. So anyway, I graduated in forestry in 68. And this is where this first slide, I went off the Peace Corps. And at that time, I was in Peace Corps training, and Ron Billings, and a lot of you know Ron Billings, most of his career in Texas, Southern Pipeline. He was in Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic. And at that time, Peace Corps got booted out of the Dominican Republic. Ron was going to Chile, and he was looking for somebody to work with. And entomology. He wanted to start kind of a park sales program, do some major collections. And I raised my hand. I said, well, that beats planting trees on the eroded lands of Chile. So I volunteered and went down with Ron in 68 in Chile. This was one of our major ways of getting around back in those days for our collection trips. This was kind of a Chilean Fort Hill survey. About a year later, if I can figure this out, boy, aging. Anyway, 1969, Andy Akeley joined us. Can we tell him? So Andy came down in 1969, and Andy remained in Chile almost 4 years. I was down there about 3, and we had a great time. I mean, we spent years surveying all through Chile. At that time, it was Billings, Andy, and myself. A year or so later, Scott Cameron came down and worked in the southern zones of Chile and Peace Corps. And we spent most of our year in the middle part of Chile, down into southern Chile. And then part of the year, we taught, and this is after one class of forest entomology, we taught forest entomology at the University of Chile, Santiago, in the forestry school. And this is where you really start feeling old. One of our students there, I think he's still working, Canadian Forest Service,
Renee
Alfaro. So Renee was one of Andy's and my students in Chile. So that's, and I think Renee's still working. Is he still working? Yeah, he's still working. We had a good run down there. This is back in my Che Guevara stage with my parade. Had a little red star. Now, after 3 years or so in Chile, Bob Guerra, who is half Chilean, he was born in Chile, lived his first 10 years in Chile, and he came on down to visit our program in Chile. And then after Peace Corps, Bob said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've done it with Peace Corps. He said, why don't you come up to grad school? So I went up to the University of Washington and did a master's on biological control using coccinellins and aphids. And Ron Billings came up. He did his PhD work up there. After Andy had did his master's in Argentina on European pine shoot law, Andy came up to grad school. We had quite I think Bob had about 13 grad students at that time. We had Billings, myself, Andy, Scott Cameron, there was Dave Holzer, Dennis Sudo, Roy Hedden, Dave Bridgewater, I might be missing some other people. Pardon?
Lassard.
Gene Lassard. There were a whole bunch of us going around. But when I finished my master's, Bob said, well, you're going to continue on for a PhD? And I said, no. Everybody was working on bark beetles. Andy was working on Doug Fir beetle. I think Ron was on mountain pine beetle. A lot of other people were on Doug Fir beetle or sick of spruce weevil. I said, look, everybody's working on bark beetles. I don't want to work on bark beetles. Little did I know that most of my career ended up with bark beetles. So I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Well, Bob said, well, wait a minute, I've got a little bit of money. How'd you like to go to Costa Rica? And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, but I don't have enough money to get you down there. He said, you're going to have to drive. Well, that's all I had. It was about a 1968 Volkswagen van. And I loaded it up in Seattle. A couple of boxes of reprints about mahogany and the mahogany shoe borer, which I did my doctoral research on. And I drove 6,000 miles. And that's a whole nother story. Going by yourself through Mexico, all through Central America, into Costa Rica. And I spent 1 year down there, drove back, and then 2 weeks later I was up in the Brooks Range in Alaska on a summer job. And then a couple of years later, I went back and I finished up. But it was a hard gig. In Costa Rica. In between this Costa Rica, we ran out of money on the grant. I went in and I was telling Steve, I was ready to go back down to finish up. I went into the bean counter at the university. I said, look, I got to get a plane ticket. And the guy looked at it and said, well, you got $2.38 left in the grant. Bob had so many students, he was robbing one grant, paying another student. So I ended up working a year with Gary Pittman, down at Boyce Thompson in Grass Valley. Then we got some more money, and I finally finished things up. But in the interim, I spent 4 summers in Alaska. So I'd spent a summer in Alaska, went back to Costa Rica for a year, come back to Costa Rica 2 weeks later. I was back up on the Yukon. And I spent 4 summers working it was a nonprofit called the Center for Northern Studies out of Wolcott, Vermont. And they picked contracts up with the National Park Service. And this was the time in Alaska in the early 70s when there was a big land grab by different agencies, establishing national parks, biological reserves. Forest Service was trying to establish new national forests. We had a grant from National Park Service. So I spent 1 summer on the Noatak, 2 summers on the Yukon, and 1 summer in Southeast, that's the Yukon River. I kind of got into the lifestyle there a couple of these summers. This is an interesting picture, that dog, and this is another story. We came within 15 minutes of eating this dog. We got in a helicopter wreck, got stranded out in the middle of nowhere for about a week and a half. In the middle of July, no food, the worst part, no bug dope. And we made a decision that we had to get out of there, and the only way we could get out of there is we're going to have something to eat. And Fortunately, the helicopter came 15 minutes before the dog was going down. After that, the dog loved helicopters. That dog, we flew around a lot. That dog, the pilots don't like animals in helicopters, but that dog would sit in the co-pilot seat and just dog me. Well, then in 1977, I got a job offer for Forest Health Management in Anchorage. And the fellow that hired me on, some of you may have known him, it was Bruce Baker. Bruce Baker hired me on, and I showed up for work like on a Monday in Anchorage. And his office was over in the regional office, which was in June. So I phoned Bruce up, only to find out Bruce resigned the previous Friday. Which was actually good news, because I didn't have a boss for 8 months. And who I was replacing, some of you may have heard this name, was P. Brush. Now, P. Brush was the entomologist in Anchorage, and he quit in about 1976, quit the Forest Service. So I was done on my own in Anchorage, but to backtrack a little bit, when I was up on one of these previous Yukon trips, I'd come back to the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and at that time in 1973, Roy Beckwith was the entomologist up in Fairbanks, and I dropped specimens off for Roy to take a look at, especially scelidids. In 1974, I'd stop back, and looking for Roy. Oh no, Roy went to Corvallis. I said, well, who's around here now? Skeeter, Skeeter. Skeeter. I said, where's Skeeter? Well, he's out in the parking lot. So I got, there's this guy with a big black beard, long hair and a little stocking cap, and he's cleaning out spear-marked blackwater traps. And I'm still in grad school at that time. Well, Skeeter gives me some sage advice back in 1974. And if you're still in school, if you work for the feds, only work 5 years in one place. Move on. It's good for your career. Well, that really worked out good for both of us. 30-something years. But we had a good run, Skeeter and I. This is kind of the early 80s. This was kind of before spruce beetle really developed. And, proper Forest Service attire. And we did a lot of work with BT and large aspen tortrix. We were doing a lot of defoliator work. Spruce beetle was just starting to build up. It wasn't a big deal in the early 80s. I mean, there might have been a couple 100,000 acres going on, but it wasn't major yet. So we had a lot of good early spray studies. Then the beetle came. And it started building up, as Skeeter talked about, in the early 90s. And these outbreaks were unlike any previous outbreaks. They had anecdotal evidence of beetle outbreaks in Alaska dating back 100 years, but most previous outbreaks would flare up, you'd lose 30% max of the overstory. Populations would collapse. It would go on for a long time. This outbreak really started kicking up, and we were losing up to 80–90% of the overstory. And one thing that kind of kicked things up is we have unmanaged stands in Alaska. And they were overmature, overstocked. And then we had, I think it was about 1993, we had the mother of all summers. And the beetle's normal 2-year life cycle went to a 1-year life cycle. And so we started doubling this population, and it just exploded. So, we were fortunate at that time. At that time, it was one of the largest bark beetle outbreaks in North America. And kept a lot of food on the table for a long time. But for 10 years, we spent a lot of time with beetle kill. Actually, it was so big, it ended up in Trivial Pursuit. There was a question, what U.S. state lost 30 million trees to beetles in 1998? Alaska. So, it was a big deal back then. The good thing about being in Alaska and being an entomologist then, there were very few of us. It was a huge state. We were kind of given a green light to do anything we wanted to do. And I was really fortunate. I worked on wildlife studies, basic biological studies, basic research studies on synthetic chemicals, competing vegetation studies, and we were just allowed to go where we wanted to go. And there were very few. At this time, and even back then, there was one state entomologist. Right now, it's Roger Burnside. We had one entomologist in Juneau, and we had a couple of research entomologists. That was Skeeter and John Hart. Well, they were retired. And then I was fortunate with another fellow, Paul Hennett, who's a pathologist at Juneau. We had a split position. And this worked out really good. Half my funding came from Forest Health. Half my funding came from P&W. So the good news is I got to go through the paneling process. Bad news was I had two bosses. Forest Health side, it was Gene Lassard, Jerry Gallup. On the P&W side, it was Gary Daterman and Rick Holsten. But it worked out good because we could play both sides of the field. We could do extension type work, typical Forest Health type monitoring, aerial surveys, and then also jump into research. This was one of the best parts on the Forest Health side. I got to see more of Alaska than most people. And the way we did aerial surveys, and we still do it up there, it's not a day-to-day thing because there's no towns to go back to. You'd load up a float plane with camping gear, which included, you had to have some survival gear, which meant fishing gear, and tents, and you took off for 10 days. And we divide the state up, and we take off for 10 days. And this was before satellite phones, and there was very little communication. So if we got to a village that happened to have a payphone, we'd phone back and say, well, we're here, and maybe in 3 days we're going to be here. And we take off. And, I did this for about 30 years with Ken, and we just had a great time. Although most of it was with fixed wing, float plane. We did some with helicopter. But flying in Alaska's got its advantages, it's got its disadvantages. I used up about 8 of my 9 lives. And right before I retired, and this is at low tide back when it went down, we were flying around, and some of you may know Kathy Matthews. She does aerial surveys in the lower plane. We were flying around and blew the engine at 700 feet. And this was not looking good. And especially if you're over water and you're on wheels. Not a good combination. The last words the pilot said, "This ain't gonna be good." As soon as the wheels hit the water, we flipped. And the high water mark before the tide went out was kind of up where the willows and alders are. Of course, you're upside down, the wings broke off. You're hanging upside down, water's coming in. Fortunately, we got out of it with minor aches and pains, but we were lucky on that one. Anyway, it was a State of Alaska airplane, and Roger was working then. I think the State of Alaska was worried we'd sue them. So they gave us this award. This is part of the bent propeller. They chromed it up. And it says State of Alaska National Resources Division for Entomologist Pucker Factory. 2008, on and on. So we each got one of the bent propellers off there, and they chromed it up, and this is what we got out of it. One last thing, though. Skeeter and I tried to form a gang, but only 2 of us can't make a gang. My moniker was Blackout. Skeeter was Meat Hook. And this was at Broadview Guard Station. I still ride a lot of motorcycles, and Skeeter started thinking he wanted to get into a little biking. But I think Pat put the kibosh on this. But anyway, in closing, a lot of my career and anything I had accomplished was basically in a main part due to these three guys here. I wish John Hard was here. I worked with John since about 1980. John still lives in Alaska. John retired in, I think, 91. And then he went back to Honors, Montana, and then he phoned me up a year later and said, I want to come back to work. I'll come to Alaska. I said, really? And he said, but I don't want to work for free, and I don't want to work full-time. So we hired him on as a returning annuitant, and he kind of picked his own schedule, and he continued working for, geez, I think 10 straight summers. So if you had a research entomologist with 30 plus years of experience, most of it Alaska, as a seasonal, I mean, this made life easy. Plus Skeeter, and the fellow in the right back there was my go-to guy, Ken Zogas. I hired him on in 1978 as a technician, and Ken's still working. He's going to retire this coming December. But a lot of what I accomplished was basically due was teaming up with these people. I mean, I had a great run. The only thing I kind of missed is I lacked any kind of experience in the continental U.S. Half my career was in Latin America or Central America, 30 years in Alaska. I wouldn't trade it for anything. So anyway, thank you all for putting up with this. And again, I thank Steve and Andy.